Good morning. I am Eliza Olson, and I serve as an Eric Zachary Wood research assistant in the Center for Constitutional Studies on the Quill Project. On behalf of the Center and Utah Valley University, let me welcome you to our annual First Amendment Conference. This year's theme is Some Assembly Required, Freedom of Association and the Right to Assembly. This morning's panel will examine freedom of assembly and the First Amendment at the time of the founding. We are joined by two eminent scholars of the American constitutional tradition. Dr. Carson Holloway is professor and department chair of political science at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. He is the author and editor of several books in political philosophy, religion and politics, and American constitutionalism, including Hamilton versus Jefferson in the Washington administration, Completing the Founding or Betraying the Founding. Among many honors, he has been the William E. Simon Visiting Fellow in Religion and Public Life at Princeton University's James Madison program. Dr. Bradford P. Wilson has long served as the executive director of the James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions, lecturer in politics, and faculty fellow of Butler College at Princeton University. His academic career has been as varied as it is distinguished. He is author of Enforcing the Fourth Amendment, A Jurisprudential History, and he has co-edited 3 essential collections of essays on American constitutionalism, including American Political Parties and Constitutional Politics, Separation of Powers in Good Government, and the Supreme Court and American Constitutionalism. He has been a Fulbright Scholar and served as research associate to 2 Chief Justices of the United States, Warren E. Burger and William H. Rehnquist. Dr. Holloway and Dr. Wilson are co-editors of invaluable new collections of the political writings of George Washington and the political writings of Alexander Hamilton, published by Cambridge University Press. Moderating this morning's discussion is Matthew Brogdon, the Larry H. and Gail Miller Family Senior Director of the Center for Constitutional Studies and Associate Professor of Political Science here at UVU. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Graduates who work in the Center for Constitutional Studies and do good work with us. It's always exciting to see them representing the university so well and showcasing what it is that we provide to students as an undergraduate-focused teaching university. As Eliza pointed out, we've got two stellar scholars of the American constitutional tradition with us, and we're going to talk this morning about freedom of assembly and implicit in that concept of freedom of association at the time of the founding. And maybe I should point out that when we say the founding, that can be a pretty capacious concept. We're talking about the creation of our constitutional order, and that didn't all actually happen at one moment. It happened, the founding itself was an inheritance, was inheriting many things that were established previously. We're going to talk about some of those. The English common law, and it continued to be developed. In fact, the First Amendment itself is the first elaboration or improvement on our Constitution. It was adopted as an amendment to the Constitution, of course proposed in 1789, ratified in 1791. So in talking about the First Amendment, we're going to talk about that in the context of the founding period, and probably even a bit past it. Talk a little bit about the 1790s, the initial efforts to implement a government under the Constitution and some of the struggles and controversies that emerged. And I can't think of 2 better interlocutors for this than Brad and Carson. I'm just delighted to be in this conversation with you two and eager to learn from you. I'm actually going to point out a couple of tendencies in the way we talk about the First Amendment. One is when we talk about the First Amendment, people tend to collapse them into a sort of broad notion of free expression, sort of pack everything into that concept that just protects free expression, which seems to be a bit of a narrowing of the First Amendment in some ways. Or alternatively, people treat speech, press, assembly, petition, free exercise of religion as sort of entirely distinct concepts that each get their own separate treatment. And I think in the minds of the founding generation and the kind of legal culture and the political theory they find themselves in, These are things that are connected. The rights that are enumerated in the First Amendment are both separate, they're distinct concepts, but they're interconnected in important ways. So the first question I have for you is to tell us a little bit about the common law background to the First Amendment, where these concepts come from, especially speech, press, petition, assembly, sort of related but distinct concepts in the common law, and maybe how those common law rights figure in the colonial experience and in the American Revolution. Let me start there. Go to it, Coase.
All right, I'll try.
You're on.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, and we tend to forget about this, I believe. There's a tendency to think of the First Amendment as a new thing that the founders invented, and to think about all these liberties as a gift from the founding, which is true, but as you were pointing out, and I like the way you put it, they're also to some extent an inheritance from the older tradition of what the founders would have called English liberty, right? They had their differences with the British because of the way they administered the colonies, but they thought that the English legal culture did represent the kind of freedom that they expected to have. And so they were not revolutionaries like the French revolutionaries who were trying to build a whole new society. Much of what they had inherited, they wanted to preserve. And then there ends up being this tension, because I think they do on all these issues end up having a more liberal or a more permissive view than the common law view would have been of these rights. So we could talk about them in turn. I mean, they start to emerge, as you say, in English history. They get defined in the common law. William Blackstone, the great commentator on the laws of England, talks about them. There's a right to petition the government. But the limits were, I think, more than they would have been for the founders later on, and certainly for us. We talk about freedom of speech and of the press. The British had a pretty strong tradition of prohibitions on seditious libel, right? Trashing the government's reputation, you might say, truly or falsely. They thought that's a more not authoritarian, that's not the word I want, a more aristocratic kind of social state, to use expression from Tocqueville, who we might talk about later. So there's more of an expectation that you'll be deferential to the government, but still with the understanding that you have a right to petition the government for redress of grievances. That goes all the way back to Magna Carta. So you see in the British experience these rights in what we might consider an embryo form, but with limitations on them that we might not expect. So you could petition the government for redress of grievances, but you might want to make sure that you don't slander the king, because then you could be on the receiving end of a seditious libel suit or something like that. With assembly as well, there's a right to assemble, but there's also prohibitions on unlawful assembly or efforts to intimidate the government or try to overawe the government, and limits on the number of people who could petition at a given time. So these all get incorporated into the First Amendment. And it's sort of, I don't know if we can fully decide who's right about this. There's a liberalization process going on at the time of the founding and immediately after, such that you can certainly say, and the Supreme Court has said recently, that you have to look at the common law experience to understand the Second Amendment, for example, and they even speak more broadly about all the amendments to the Constitution. But at the same time, you wouldn't want to necessarily equate the meaning of these terms with the common law understanding. If you do that, you end up with a much narrower understanding than we're used to. One last thing, if I can, on freedom of speech and of the press. To go back to Blackstone for a minute, Blackstone's understanding of freedom of the press was simply that there are no prior restraints. There cannot be a censor or a licensor who can stop you from publishing, who wants to inspect or has the authority to inspect what you're going to publish. But you can certainly be held to account for anything you published after the fact. You could be sued, you could be prosecuted for libel, and that's just the British understanding. A lot of the Americans at the time of the founding held that understanding. I think it's kind of a federalist understanding. The so-called Republicans or Jeffersonians want to push it in a more expansive direction that would be more familiar to us today, I think.
That's very helpful. To drill down on this a little bit, in the common law, there's some distinction about who exactly is protected. So who gets the right to speak and to publish and to assemble? In fact, I guess in the most radical view, some people even say this is confined to, it's connected to Republican government because it's confined to representatives of the people, that the most capacious speech and debate is actually in the legislature.
Yeah.
Does that transfer over into the American founding at all, or is that something that we abandoned?
To the original deliberations and debates over the First Amendment when it was proposed, these issues have to be sorted. And I mean, the first thing I'd want to say is simply that the language of the First Amendment suggests that all of these liberties are rights that precede the First Amendment and are simply being secured by it. And then the question is, well, what's the origin of these rights if it's not the Constitution and the Bill of Rights itself? And I think the origin is first and foremost in the common law. And if pressed, we might say some of them are in fact natural rights. But obviously, if those of you who have studied, say, Hobbes and Locke, the state of nature is not a social place. So most of these rights are exercised in community. So I think that's where the common law is very helpful in taking natural right thinking and turning it into a social kind of understanding of what our rights are. So there's that, but yes, when you look at the British development of, say, something like the right of petition, the big debates there are over, can you petition the king directly, or do you have to go to the legislature, to the parliament, first to your representative, and then he or she's supposed to introduce it to the parliament as a whole. And rights of assembly are not exactly encouraged in the discussions in the 1600s and 1700s. You know, they look at assemblies as potentially seeds of social disturbance. And so they say, well, an assembly is when you have 3 people together. This is in Blackstone too. You don't have an assembly until there are 3 people. And what are they up to? Well, it could be something fine, something decent, something that doesn't disturb the public peace. But, you know, oftentimes when you need to have penalties for when those assemblies start plotting illegal activity, and then he has distinctions. There's this kind of more peaceful assembly, then there's what he calls a rout, and then there's a riot. That's the worst of all, you know? So when they talk about the right of assembly, it's always with these caveats and concerns about how they might get out of control and actually disturb the public peace and malign the authority of the king and the parliament. And that's where you get towards you enter into the conversation about what sedition is and what seditious libel would be.
So let me pose two questions here to draw this out. One is about the common law. So the common law, the English common law, is a thing that develops over time. It's judges filling in the gaps in law. There's not a great deal of legislation in sort of Renaissance England at this period. So judges wind up filling in the gaps, and that includes fleshing out what are limits on government, what are the rights the citizen possesses, and working this out. That's a very evolutionary process. Judges are trying to work out what are these rights, some of them being natural rights that they say they're discovering, not just inventing. But that's a process where the rights are developing, and then the First Amendment adopts this right, which you say is pre-existing. So one question is, how do those two facts interact? That is, we treat the First Amendment as a written law that we've adopted, the people ratified, and it became a fixed law. In fact, we put a great deal of emphasis on this, that it has a discrete, discoverable meaning that we can enforce, and that's what we do whenever we strike down a state law or a federal law. But if that right came from a sort of development of common law where the right was developing over time, then how do we deal with that interaction between a right that was developing and is now fixed? And I think connected to that, how did it develop in the Revolution? So maybe, we can deal with speech, press, and assembly, but maybe especially assembly. How did those rights change in the course of the Revolution and in this period before the Constitution's written?
Well, let me talk just about one of them, and that's assembly. During the Revolution, there were Sons of Liberty groups. There were committees of correspondence. There were all kinds of organizations, political organizations that came from the ground up. And in resistance, as it turned out, in resistance to British authority. And of course that's part of the American historical awareness when you get to the founding period. The Revolution is not forgotten. But in the 1790s, these kinds of committees were resurrected by the Jeffersonian Republicans. They were called Democratic Republican Societies or something like that, in various cities. And then what they did was gather together, figure out how to, with petitioning government on certain kinds of things, starting newspapers and ripping on Hamilton in particular, but eventually on Washington himself. And from Hamilton and Washington's point of view, my guess is they looked upon these new forms of citizen collaboration as more of a bad thing than a good thing.
More routs or riots.
Yes, because of the riot and sedition aspects of it. Remember, this is a very fragile republic in the 1790s. Both sides of the new parties that have formed think that things are falling apart. The Union may not hold, that will end up in separate confederacies, primarily divided between North and South. And Jefferson thought that, Hamilton and Washington thought that. So the rise of these rabble-rousing committees alarmed Hamilton and Washington, not Jefferson. He was fine with them. And this is where it gets interesting to me, in that Hamilton and Washington are thinking more in terms of, I think, the concerns that the British had about citizen involvement, what we now think of as democracy. Because citizens are likely coming from partial views, they're likely not as well informed as their representatives, and the purpose of representation is to have the representatives have the experience and knowledge to be able to make good public policy and be thrown out at the next election. That's where the citizens' real action is. It's in voting and judging, but not in trying to dictate to their representatives how they should decide in their deliberative bodies. And that's a kind of federalist view. It's not Jefferson's, or Madison's. It's at least as Madison's ideas develop. It's Hamilton and Washington and the High Federalists.
So I'm gonna ask Carson to chime in here in just a second, but I did want to just give maybe we've thrown into the mix a few terms at this point. Let's make sure that our student audience is following us. So the Constitution's written in 1787 and ratified in 1788. We get the First Amendment added by the first Congress in 1789 and ratified in 1791. So when we talk about Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison fighting over how to understand these First Amendment rights of speech, press, assembly, and petition, we're talking about in this period, this sort of early partisan period, when our first sort of political contest is emerging with Hamiltonian Federalists with Hamilton, Washington, Adams on one side, and Jeffersonian Republicans on the other, with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison being their principal political leaders. So they've got a real divide over how to understand these rights. And it seems like want to see them develop in two different ways from the common law. Federalists wanting to hew closer to what the common law envisioned, the pre-existing common law right. Jeffersonians wanting to recognize perhaps more of what the Revolution added to those rights. Carson, what would you add to this?
I want to throw in one thing to build upon something Brad was saying earlier, but then I want to try to answer your first question because I think I can answer it adequately. But I was thinking about the expression that many of you may have heard, read somebody the riot act, right? That's used as an expression for as reprimand, somebody in authority reprimands you or something like that. But that actually emerges from the tradition that Brad was talking about earlier. Read somebody the riot act means there's a potentially unlawful assembly and somebody gets up and reads the riot act and says, you are on the verge of going to prison because if you don't disperse and disassemble, you're in violation of the riot act. Your question, though, had to do with the evolutionary character of common law rights versus their reification, if that's the right word, or their making them stable in the First Amendment. I think there's a way to reconcile those things. Certainly those in American constitutional law on the Supreme Court and elsewhere who do originalism act as if there's an original meaning, an original public meaning of the Constitution that can be discerned, and that should be the guide. So that might create a tension with the idea that these rights developed in an evolutionary manner. I think the reconciliation of those things is possible on the basis of the tradition, and the thing I would observe is that the understanding, even as the common law developed, was that any statute of Parliament could trump the common law. So when Parliament decided to legislate in an authoritative way and give you a written statute, that would control the common law. That was the dominant view. So I think once you get to America, that view is also held, certainly about Congress's power, but also about the power of the people as the fundamental legislative authority when they enact a constitution. Mm-hmm. So I think and I've seen the Supreme Court talk this way about these issues in their opinions, that if you want to know what the First Amendment means or any of the amendments, you want to look at the original public meaning, how it was understood by the generation that ratified it, and then the common law development will be a clue to how they understood it, but the original public meaning at the point of ratification would be the authoritative meaning. The common law development would be a body of material that helps you understand the original public meaning, but not authoritative over it.
Well, it sounds like when we drop into 1791, which is when the First Amendment's ratified, what we find is the beginnings of and what will blossom into a pretty robust dispute over how to understand these rights, especially the emergence of political parties in America and the idea of a loyal opposition. So maybe we can climb into that a little bit. The debate. What were the range of meanings that were being contested around that time, at the time of the enactment of the ratification of the First Amendment, and then in the years following. So there's some key disputes that come up in this period. One set of them revolves around the French Revolution and how the United States should respond to it. In this period, of course, the French had a Republican revolution, deposed and beheaded their king and a lot of other people, and adopted a new government, claiming in a way a lineage from the American Declaration of Independence, an elaboration on our own revolution.
Jefferson was instrumental in those early days of the French Revolution. He was over there.
So how does that, explain to me how these things going on in France translate into a dispute about the First Amendment in America? What is it what's at the heart of the dispute for us on this side of the Atlantic when these things are going on?
I suppose one thing we need to talk about is how the form of government shapes our understanding of the First Amendment. Because remember, the common law is developed in Great Britain with its king, lords, and commons. It's a monarchical form of government. And very, as Carson mentioned, extraordinarily deferential to political authority. The ordinary folks like us, our job is to take care of our private affairs, our families, our civic communities, but leave the big issues to the parliament and king together. then you think about our own form of government, and it's a republic. There's no king, there's no lords, that we do have the House of Representatives, which is a kind of commons, but, and I think the divide here is one between Madison and Jefferson, who are now thinking entirely as Republicans, which they read to be Democrats. And even though they, of course, are in favor of representative government, which is what distinguishes, in Madison's own mind, republics from democracies, they nonetheless thought that there was, in a republic like ours, the people were sovereign, and they have a right to influence public policy, not just when they vote, but in between elections. And so they were encouraging citizen participation in between elections. This is not the case with the Federalists, as I understand them. They really were, in a way, thinking like the British, in that they wanted to maintain the authority of government, which depended on the confidence of the people. And they saw the kinds of activities of the social democratic societies as undermining the confidence of the people in the legitimacy of their government.
So how were these democratic societies operating? I mean, what was so controversial about having democratic Republican societies?
Well, one point of controversy goes back to what you mentioned in the French Revolution. They emerged in relation to the visit to the United States of Edmond Genet, who was the French minister, and he involved himself in them. And so there's a double problem, I think, from the standpoint of the Federalists. One is what Brad was just talking about. Their attitude was more that the people should vote. Once they elect their representatives, those people represent the people's authority. This is the way Hamilton talks about it, that, you know, we have, like, you think about kind of contemporary or more recent populist politics, and people say things like power to the people as a way of defending a demonstration or a protest or something like that. But somebody like Hamilton and Washington would say the real power to the people is that they can elect the government. That's real power. That's legislative power and executive power. And if you have demonstrations or protests or riots or associations that try to muscle or overawe the government, then they're really detracting from the people's power. So they want to maintain those traditions of deference to the government. It's not deference to the government as an aristocratic institution anymore. It's deference to the government as the expression of the people's right to rule. And they're worried about factionalism, right? And you know, I guess loud minorities that can somehow stop the government or intimidate the government from doing what the people have elected it to do. So that's one problem. Then the other problem, or the thing that compounds it, is when you have a foreign representative like Genet, who comes over and starts meeting with these associations and wants the American government to be more pro-French in the war between Britain and France, to be more pro-French revolutionary, perhaps than the elected authorities want to be, because Hamilton and Washington wanted to maintain a policy of neutrality. And as Alexander Hamilton complained in some of his on-the-side public journalism at the time, Genet said, "I'll just appeal to the people. I will talk to the people, and I will get them stirred up." And the attitude of the Federalists was, you're not supposed to do that. You talk to the president if you're a foreigner. And they think it's very dangerous and destabilizing to the country and to any country. Hamilton lays it down in one of his public pieces as a sacred maxim that foreign representatives are not to try to divide the people from their government, because no government would want that. Kind of a basic example of political ethics, right? The golden rule. If you don't want it done to you, you don't do it to another country. So he considered that Genet had behaved very improperly, and that the government had been very kind of patient with him and not simply expelling him and kicking him out and sending him back to France. But I think both of those problems were uppermost in their minds in these kinds of situations.
So we usually think, I mean, that this of course results in the Alien and Sedition Acts eventually, which are infamous, right? They're sort of, to associate anything with the Alien and Sedition Act so much to impeach them in our constitutional discourse. And we usually think about the Sedition Act, which punished seditious speech, speech that was meant to undermine the government. But we really think of the Alien Act. So there was the Alien Enemies Act, and this was aimed at, in what way was this connected with what's going on with Genet and the French? I mean, was this
Very
aimed
much
at sort
so,
of busting
yeah.
up?
They were concerned about French immigration, bringing revolutionary ideas into the country.
But not just immigration, but the political activism of
You're
these
right.
French revolutionaries.
But this has always been a concern of Jefferson's too, that people coming from countries that don't have republican forms of government will not be good citizens of this country because they're bringing foreign notions of what legitimacy is. So there was nothing shocking about the Alien Act in that sense. I mean, they were just trying to police the kind of political culture of the country by monitoring who's coming in.
And so that everyone knows, it was accompanied by an Alien Friends Act. So we had an Alien
that's right.
Enemies
Good
Act
point.
and an
Yeah.
Alien Friends Act, and very clearly distinguishing between these two.
Well, yeah, the Alien Enemies Act would be triggered if we were at war with another nation. That raises a bunch of concerns, and they were worried about the possibility of war with France. And the complaints about the Alien Acts had to do with the fact, I mean, some of the complaints are, I'm going to give you my own opinion. Some of them are serious, some of them I think are foolish from the Republicans like Jefferson. To some extent, they'll argue as if, well, the federal government has no power over aliens. That's entirely a state matter. I don't take that very seriously. That's not where our country ended up. We do have a right in the federal government to regulate immigration. But their complaint that I think was more powerful was the kind of massive, in their mind, delegation of authority to the president to just expel people that he judged were threats to American security. So that's a big discretion to give to the president.
Which is still a feature of American immigration law.
Yeah, I think so. But on the Sedition Act, that's really useful for thinking about the things where we began, the issues where we began about the common law. It's interesting to look at that dispute because the Jeffersonian Republicans thought the Sedition Act was so terrible, and the Federalists sort of threw up their hands and said, this is not such a bad thing. We actually view it as a liberalization of the common law standards. The reason the Federalists thought that the Sedition Act was a liberalization of the common law standards is because it specified that it would only punish speech against the government that was false and defamatory, whereas the British common law tradition punished just defamatory speech. Criminal libel in British common law didn't have to be false because they viewed it as a danger of the breach of peace. If you think about it with an individual and then also with the government, if you find out something negative about somebody and publish it in the newspaper, it's really humiliating to them. Even if it's true, maybe especially if it's true, that might enrage them and lead them to come to your house and beat you up or something like that. So under the common law standards, that's a libel. You're not allowed to do that. That's a criminal libel, even if it's true. And they applied the same thinking to seditious libel. Even if you're saying something true about the government, if you're defaming it, you're creating the possibility of disorder, so you can be punished for that. The American Sedition Act, the Federalists defended because it made a provision for a truth defense, and it specified in the definition of the crime that it had to be false speech about the government. And they did this because I think of the concerns that Brad was talking about earlier, that these democratic societies and some of the so-called Jeffersonian or Republican newspapers are out of control. They're defaming the government all the time. They're claiming that it's a conspiracy to destroy people's rights, and we got to put a stop to this. Whereas the Jeffersonians did not believe, I would put it this way, because of the First Amendment's text and because there's no delegated power over the press, their interpretation of the Constitution was the federal government has no authority over the press at all. And I think they felt betrayed too, because this stuff had come up in the ratification debates. And when the Anti-Federalists first floated the idea of a protection for freedom of the press, some of the Federalists responded and said, we don't need that. There's no power delegated over the press at all. There's nothing to worry about. That view didn't prevail, and you got the First Amendment. And I think the Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, felt burned because then the Federalists come forward with these interpretations of the text of the First Amendment, alleging that it's compatible with the Sedition Act, when a few years ago you were telling us there's no power over the press at all. So that's the way that disagreement plays out.
I think we've got a pretty good review of some of the basic disputes. I want to ask one more question, and then I want to turn to some Q&A from the audience. It's been about our last 10 minutes. of this part of the program, taking some questions. But I want to try to drill down a little bit on the difference, particularly with Washington and Hamilton on one side, Jefferson and Madison on the other, with respect to assemblies. We've mentioned these Democratic-Republican societies a couple of times. Their connection to the controversy over France and the French Revolution and the French and British War. What exactly when we say that Washington and Hamilton were dubious about them or suspicious of them, what was proposed? And I guess first, what were they doing that seemed to be potentially criminal or disorderly? And second, what exactly were Federalists proposing to do to them? I mean, we think a group of people getting together to propose or advance a set of political positions or even a position on an ongoing war wouldn't be particularly controversial or insurrectionary. What was it that Hamilton and Jefferson or that Hamilton and Washington are proposing to do about, or maybe the way that they look at these?
I think, so Washington, I believe, Carson, correct me if I'm wrong, in a letter connects those societies to the Whiskey Rebellion as the consequence of this kind of agitation.
So what was
the
the
first
Whiskey
ripe
Rebellion?
fruit of the democratic societies? So there's a connection between these societies and open insurrection against the government.
And the Whiskey Rebellion was, remind our audience.
So this was in western Pennsylvania. A popular crop was grain that could be turned into alcohol. You've heard of stills, and then by turning it into alcohol, it preserved it so it could be shipped to markets and last a long time. Now, I think they were also drinking a lot of it themselves, a group of them organized and decided they were going to resist the tax collectors who were coming. There was an excise tax that Hamilton had advocated and the Congress had legislated into existence with Washington's assent. And it was a domestic tax on a domestic product. And these had been very controversial in the Revolutionary days when Britain was trying to tax the stamp tax and other things. So people had a kind of visceral dislike of the notion of internal taxation of that nature. But of course now we call it internal, but it's now their own government that's doing it. It's not a foreign government where they had no representation. So Hamilton saw this as a key part of raising the revenues necessary for the new government to pay down the public debt. And as I say, Congress approved it, but those folks out in western Pennsylvania didn't. And they started to harass the tax collectors and even commit violent acts against them. So,
is it true that Washington rode out at the head of a column?
Yeah, Hamilton too.
As commander-in-chief?
I mean, we'd probably blame Hamilton today. Here he is, Secretary of the Treasury. The Secretary of War is on vacation. So Hamilton steps in as basically acting Secretary of War, but rides a horse to put down the rebellion. But it's interesting, just as a little historical footnote, his wife was terribly ill with a pregnancy that ended in a miscarriage while he was away on this expedition. And we could just say, what an awful thing for him to do, to leave her behind. And he justifies it by saying, I had to go because it was my idea to have the tax in the first place. And so I have to show that I'm willing to defend the idea by going out there and fighting the rebels, you know. I mean, can you imagine a Secretary of Treasury doing that today for a tax he'd proposed?
So what was the connection between, you said that Washington and Hamilton regard this as the first fruits of the Democratic-Republican societies. So
yeah, I'm not very clear on it myself as to whether there's actually a provable cause and effect
So
here.
did they think they could actually suppress the Democratic-Republican societies?
They never proposed that in letters or anywhere else. I think they wanted to discredit them. as legitimate forms of influencing governmental policy.
Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, Washington said that in a letter, that he hoped the Whiskey Rebellion would discredit the democratic societies. That's very interesting, though, as a way of seeing the difference in opinion between something like Hamilton and Jefferson, because Jefferson made fun of Hamilton's. He didn't say anything about Washington, but he made fun of Hamilton's hatred of the Whiskey Rebellion. And Jefferson's famous for having said, a little rebellion in politics is okay once in a while. It's like a storm. Remind the government that the people in charge. But Hamilton doesn't look at it that way. He says in his published journalism of the time, this is like 1/60th of the country trying to resist the will of the majority because the majority voted for these taxes. If you believe in democracy, you have to be on the side of suppressing the Whiskey Rebellion because people cannot get away with breaking the law. Part of the answer to your earlier question, though, is it's not just a question of the people getting together and talking about politics and telling the government what's on their mind. I mean, I think from the point of view of Hamilton and Washington, these societies were routinely stirring the pot in the way that was disreputable. They're lying about the government's policies. They're telling people they're unconstitutional. They're telling you that this is a plot to deprive you of your liberties. So it's possible to think about these liberties as being abused by this particular use. Could I read a passage from Washington? Yes. This is on a different level. This goes to the concern he had about these societies, even if they weren't being all that abusive. He wrote in a letter to Burgess Ball on September 25th of 1794, George Washington said, "For can anything be more absurd, more arrogant, or more pernicious to the peace of society? For self-created bodies forming themselves into permanent censors, and under the shade of night in a conclave resolving that acts of Congress, which have undergone the most deliberate and solemn discussion by the representatives of the people, chosen for the express purpose, and bringing with them from the different parts of the Union the sense of their constituents, endeavoring as far as the nature of the thing will admit to form their will into laws for the government of the whole. I say under these circumstances, for a self-created permanent body, for no one denies the right of the people to meet occasionally, to petition or to remonstrate against any act of the legislature, to declare that this act is unconstitutional, and that act is pregnant with mischief, and that all who vote contrary to their dogmas are actuated by selfish motives under foreign influence, nay, are pronounced traitors to the country, is such a stretch of arrogant presumption as to be reconciled with laudable motives." No, he says, I don't think it is. So they're not being actuated by decent motives. They're defaming the government and stirring up, and other Federalists thought this way. The first step toward insurrection is to defame the government, and that's what he thought they were doing.
I'm going to, I actually want us to cut to take some questions from the audience. And I'd like our first question to come from a student. So why don't we, a bit of an unofficial policy here. If we can, if you have any questions, we've got a couple of folks with roving mics, or at least one. Have any questions about this question of freedom of assembly, about the First Amendment at the founding, maybe about how some of this relates to the way we think about the First Amendment now?
Well, while they're working up their nerve, there's one.
There's one in the back right there.
Hi. I like to think about like the modern context for a lot of these freedoms, and the freedom of press, kind of that balance of individual freedom with different people and journalists and publishers and stuff, as well as some form of control of, like, I don't know how to phrase it, just like preventing any extremist things from happening. I feel like there's a lot. It's like an age of information that we're in right now, but it's also an age of misinformation. And so I just wondered what your guys' thoughts were about, like, kind of that balance that, like, the founding fathers were initially going for with the freedom of press and allowing, kind of what Jefferson was saying, like allowing some discourse to happen, but also not letting it get out of hand, and how is there even a balance that's happening today, or is it something that is a concern?
Yeah, so I guess are Are efforts to police misinformation, are they the new sort of libel laws?
Well, it's interesting that the sides have flipped in a sense. If you think of the Federalists as the conservatives and the Jeffersonian Republicans as the liberals of the founding, we're in a different situation today, I think, because a generation or two ago, the liberals in American politics tended to be free speech absolutists. No holds barred, the government should not intervene, and the conservatives were a little more skeptical of that. I mean, of course, there's a common ground American tradition. Everybody believes in freedom of the press. There's nobody who wants arbitrary controls on the press. But the older generation of conservatives were more in favor of certain regulations, laws against obscenity, better protections for reputation through libel laws and things like that. And now we're in a situation where it seems like the conservatives are carrying on the older liberal tradition and tend to be, like today, defenders of free speech absolutism. They don't think the government should regulate speech at all. But today's left is more interested in combating misinformation, which can lead to extremism, which can then lead to insurrection. That's the kind of chain of reasoning that would have been very familiar to Hamilton, who was kind of a conservative of the founding, but now the left is more interested in that. But I think it is sobering and moderating to look at these debates at the time of the founding, because if you look at proposals to regulate speech to some extent today, you might think they're outrageous and they're totally outside the scope. And I'm not necessarily endorsing them. They might be dangerous or ill-informed. But it's not really the case that they're totally unheard of, because if you go all the way back to the founding, there was a lot more acceptance of the idea that those who had political authority could regulate speech and press in the interest of the common good.
I think we have time for one more question before we break. And if not, we'll...
In the back there.
Yes, absolutely, please.
So,
This is President Jimenez.
yes, so thank you very much for such an interesting conversation. I am thinking of the January 6th, insurrection, or that might have just been the right to assemble. So how would, in today's context, how would the Washingtonian, Hamiltonian, Federalist versus the democratic republicanism of, it's Washington, Hamilton on one side, Jefferson, Madison on the other. Because I think today, relating to the previous question on misinformation and technology, we're living in very different historical times, different technological times. And there's that debate on the originalism versus what Justice Stephen Breyer said the other day, you've got to be pragmatic, and things change over time. So how do you think this should play out in terms of how we interpret the Constitution with the January 6th insurrection? And I bring that up because I grew up in the Philippines. It was so normal for us to have a lot of violence. Yeah. But I don't think that that's what's intended for the American democratic system.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be, cautious about trying to map the founding disputes onto our current situation, because it is so different in so many ways. We're a much more democratic country than we were in their time, and that's due to historical developments in the country. And so, popular involvement, just think of public opinion polls, the public involvement in trying to influence public policy is, there's a lot more of it than there was at the time of the founding. But that having been said, you look at something like January 6th, well, Jefferson, thought a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. He thought that, with Locke actually, he thought that if there's a rebellion against government, it's because there's oppression. That is Locke's view, that not that there's the thought that I'm oppressed, there is oppression. And that's what creates these disturbances. So a moderate, prudent government shouldn't have anything to worry about if they're governing well, right? Then there's not oppressing anybody and there won't be these kinds of disturbances. So Jefferson would look at it probably as just what happens in democracies, and it is acceptable behavior now and then. Whereas, I think the Jefferson or Hamilton and Washington would have been appalled. It's just the sort of thing that they feared, that the legitimacy of the government itself was being called into question and being undermined, and the confidence of the people in the government was being lost.
Well, that's a good note to land on. We're going to take a brief break. We will return at 11, so about 10 minutes, and then we'll resume our discussion at 11 o'clock. Look forward to seeing you all back. Just another minute, and we will, for those of you who have been here for the first session, we'll be starting back up. For those of you just coming in, we'll be getting started. Well, welcome. For those of you who are just joining us, this is the second segment of our morning session on free assembly at the founding. This is part of our annual First Amendment Conference hosted by the Center for Constitutional Studies here at UVU. We do this every year, and this year we're focusing on free association and free assembly, two rights we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. In the first session, we talked a good bit about the background to the First Amendment, how the rights enumerated in the First Amendment, those rights of speech, press, assembly, and petition, are rights that pre-existed the founding. They didn't, those terms were not first used in the First Amendment. They were terms that referred to rights that had developed and had been recognized in the English common law, and as some of what we talked about, changed both in England as they were implemented, in some cases expanding and contracting, and of course in the American context, changed in significant ways. So I want to introduce this second segment of our panel by retracing very briefly the sort of development that we've seen. So the American Revolution occurs in 1776. This involves things like the Sons of Liberty and organizations that meet and organize themselves and work to win American independence from British foreign rule. That's one way to put it. And in that struggle, of course, the activity of the people in publishing their views, in organizing together in unofficial groups to advance the cause of independence, to advance the cause of colonial rights under British rule, all push the boundaries of the First Amendment rights, I should say First Amendment rights, the various rights we've been talking about, those rights of speech, press, assembly, and petition. And they were exercising those. This is one of the reasons why what we think of now as a governmental body, something like the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress, which are drafting documents, initially weren't drafting declarations of independence, but were drafting petitions to send to the king to explain why they thought they were entitled to certain rights or why there ought to be alterations in British policy, were in fact exercising this right to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. So when the First Amendment refers to that, it's referring to a tradition of rights that's pre-existing. At the same time, we've seen after the Revolution, you all know, it's been about a decade sort of fumbling through creating a union of states, the American Union. We eventually wrote a new constitution in 1787. It did not say anything. Well, it did say something about speech and debate, actually. It had a speech and debate clause, but the speech and debate clause protected members of Congress who had a right to free speech and debate in the legislature as representatives of the people. So the original Constitution doesn't have a right of free speech or press or assembly or petition for the people at large. Where those were found, they would have been found in state constitutions at the time. The federal Constitution didn't include them, and so at the insistence of the Constitution's critics, we add a set of amendments. Congress proposes 12 amendments. We adopted 10 of those. They were ratified in 1791. And the first of them, at least the first of those that were ratified, is the one that says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's the First Amendment as it appears in the Constitution. The people of the United States ratified it in 1791 through their state legislatures, and it's been part of our Constitution ever since. Perhaps the most recognizable part of our Constitution, interestingly. So we've been talking about, in the first segment this morning, how in the early republic, our first efforts in the first decades to implement a new government and to navigate political differences and political contests, we had the emergence of political disputes and, of course, of political parties. We had Washington and Hamilton at the head of the Federalist Party. John Adams plays a role in the Federalist Party too. And in the political opposition, during Washington's presidency, his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, becomes the leader of a political opposition and is joined, of course, by a member of the House of Representatives, James Madison, who was a principal member of the Constitutional Convention. So we've got these founders of our regime who find themselves on the opposite side of a partisan divide in the early republic. And what we've been talking about are some of the disputes that they wind up encountering. We finished with the Whiskey Rebellion most recently. We were talking about this rowdy sort of assault on tax collectors in western Pennsylvania in defense of their untaxed whiskey, and how that led to some of the disputes over whether people should be able to politically organize, what kinds of political organization go too far and undermine public order and the rule of law, and what kinds are legitimate. I actually want to start with political parties for a moment. Political parties for us are sort of public institutions. We think of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party almost as governmental institutions. Although legally, those political parties are not governmental institutions. They are private associations in constitutional law. The Democratic Party is not a governmental institution in our law. And so even though we may think of it that way, they're not. And as they emerged in the early republic, they were quite contested. Maybe let's start there. A lot of our disputes over assemblies and associations of people come from their connection to political division and conflict. So how did the founders view the emergence of political parties in the 1790s? And how does that play into this question of assembly?
I think if you took a survey of founders' opinions in 1789 of the legitimacy of political parties, there would have been a consensus that they were not legitimate, or at least they were not conducive to good government. They regarded them as nurseries of what they called faction, which is a partial view of what's good for the public, the Commonwealth, as opposed to a view that is for the common good of the entire Commonwealth. So they were opposed to political parties. And if it was through that lens, I believe, that Hamilton and Washington, it fed into their alarm of these democratic Republican societies. They saw them as factions, representing the views of a minority of the population, but aimed at having their views imposed on the country at large. So with that kind of attitude, and Jefferson was just as hostile to parties in his early period as were the Federalists. And indeed, Jefferson attempts to get out of the kind of tension between his opposition to parties and his very activities in forming one when he wins in 1800, and then he wants to call it a day. Parties are over. It was just necessary at this point in time to build one, because The Federalists were themselves a faction trying to institute a monarchy or something along the British Constitution, the lines of the British Constitution, to replace our great constitutional republic. So it was a necessary evil. I've done it. And then he says in his first inaugural, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, you know. And then he went about instituting Republican policies. You know, it really wasn't, I think, until after that election and maybe a bit later, Martin Van Buren and others, where parties really became considered a very good thing. And if I could just do a little American Government 101 here, the original idea, you look at Federalist number 10, James Madison. He says, look, the big threat to Republican government is factions. Or factions, majority faction in particular, where a majority gets control of the levers of government, imposes its views on not just those who agree with it, but those who don't, invading their rights in so doing. What's the solution? Representative government over a large territory, so large that there's a multiplicity of interests, economic, geographical, religious, and so forth, so that when all of the representatives come together in Congress, they can deliberate with one another from their partial perspectives, from wherever they're coming, whatever their constituencies might wish of them, and deliberate together with and try to discern what the public welfare demands, not their partial part of the country, right? And so something like these societies, they're factions. And what changes, I think, is that political parties in the 19th century, as they develop, end up doing the very same thing that the founders expected Congress to do. They become coalitions of a multiplicity of interests, each party, which moderates them. The extremes drop off because they can't command a consensus within their party. And so I think that's how they became legitimate. They ended up doing much of the work of coalition building that originally was thought to be done in the Congress itself.
Carson, what would you say to the question of how political parties, the emergence of political parties, is sort of fed the dispute over assembly and the ability of people to assemble and act as groups outside of legislatures?
Well, I was thinking about what you said a few minutes ago and how well it illustrates some of the things we were talking about in the first half of the program. And I was thinking about the way the Federalists would think about this, and then we could also talk about the way the Republicans would. But when you talked about what had happened during the founding, the First Continental Congress, organizations like that, those are extra legal bodies, right? They're not provided for by law. So from the British point of view, this looks like not good behavior, right?
Maybe January 6th.
Yeah, and in fact, the American revolutionaries, when some of them used acts of violence to intimidate British colonial officials, also not good. So you can ask what's different once you have the country founded. I think the Federalist view is that those things should not be necessary anymore because the government you have represents you. We had those institutions or those organizations, and we used some tactics during the revolution because we were dealing with a government that had power over us, over which we had no power, no formal power. Taxation without representation, right? The colonists were not represented in the British Parliament. So the only thing they could do was to assemble, lawfully or unlawfully, and petition and to remonstrate until it got to the point where there was a contest of arms. And Jefferson seems to want to carry that tradition further and think it's legitimate to do that even against your own democratically elected government, whereas Washington and Hamilton think that should not be necessary to do that anymore. We have elections. Leave it to the people who've been elected to carry out the policies they want. If they're not satisfactory, then vote against them. And we shouldn't have to have these informal parties or societies or clubs to try to persuade or intimidate the government.
Yeah, I want to, so far we've been talking about assembly and association in very political terms. That is, we've been talking about political parties and associations that are aimed at bringing about a change in policy, and those are very familiar to us. We have them now. The First Amendment clearly protects them. In fact, the Supreme Court considers political speech to be the, sort of most protected form of speech. You face the government faces the highest burdens whenever it wants to regulate political speech and political activity. But when we actually employ association, it's not always for those political purposes. In fact, maybe not mostly. If we think about the associations we all belong to, religious associations, civic associations, clubs, sports, familial organizations, professional organizations, most of them are not principally concerned with bringing about changes in policy or political activism, but that's most of the associating we're doing. It seems like so far the discourse that's happening at the founding is about the political dimensions of associations, the political dimensions of speech and press. But in fact, those rights are much broader and they cover a much broader swath of American life, what we sometimes call voluntary associations. So I think it might be a good point to transition and ask, at what point in American constitutionalism in our early history did these First Amendment rights of association, and I guess we'd have to bring in here the free exercise of religion and press and assembly, become about those other kinds of associations, those non-political associations?
When you read John Locke's letter on toleration, one of the arguments he is contending against is one that says civic associations are not a threat to the public peace. They're fine, but ecclesiastical ones, they are, because these are people all who are on the same page, right? But they only constitute a part of the political body, and if they get a bee in their bonnet to make trouble for the government of the UK, it will lead to chaos and perhaps civil war of some kind. And Locke has to contend with this argument that the church is a particularly dangerous kind of association. His answer to that is it's no more dangerous than the civic associations. Why? Because we have, in his language, a natural right to conscience. And he says the fact that we all have the same natural right to conscience is a kind of buffer against anyone using governmental authority to violate the conscious convictions, religious convictions of anyone else. Now, whether it sounds good formally spoken like that, whether it works out in practice or not is going to be a big experiment, but it's our experiment. That's in fact what we've done with religious life in the United States. How many associations of how many churches exist in just this one town? It's astounding. You won't find this anywhere else. And they're peaceful. They're not at each other's throat. So I think Locke has been vindicated in that opinion about them being no more a problem for the public peace than civic associations.
Carson?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. One, this reminds me, Madison says at the end of Federalist 51, in a big republic like the United States, multiplicity of factions will protect civil liberty, multiplicity of religious sects will protect religious liberty. So it might be a problem in a certain kind of community if you have one big powerful church that can throw its weight around, but in a country like America, you don't have that problem because there's so much diversity of religious belief, which lends itself to the outcome that you can allow churches to organize as formal corporations and not worry that they're going to dominate the scene because there's so many of them and they're so different. One interesting development that I wanted to point out, though, on the question of constitutional interpretation and the right of association. It doesn't depend upon the First Amendment, but it could perhaps today, it would have implicated the First Amendment if it came up today. But I'm thinking it didn't at the time. I'm thinking about the Dartmouth College case, which depended upon the Contracts Clause. And that was involved in the party competition of the time. The Jeffersonian Republicans in where's Dartmouth? Is it New Hampshire?
It's New Hampshire.
Yeah, in that state, they viewed Dartmouth as a Republican, as a Federalist institution, and they tried to take it over. They passed new laws reconfiguring the Board of Governors and all these things, and they took it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall, who was a Federalist, developed its Contracts Clause jurisprudence by saying that the original charter of the college is a contract that the state government cannot violate. The Contracts Clause is often overlooked, but very important to protecting this right to associate if you count, as Marshall did, corporate charters as contracts. So that creates certain room in civil society for groups of people and founders of private institutions to create them and to give them life beyond the life of the founder. Because when you create a corporation, it becomes an artificial person. Dartmouth was already very old by the time this case came along. So that's, I think, an important and often overlooked development in American constitutionalism to protect the integrity of free association.
To connect this to the conversation we're having, it is a remarkable development that in the United States, especially in the 19th century, we not only tolerate associations, but we actually let private associations have legal existence. We give them the ability to exist as the American Civil Liberties Union. No one person owns the American Civil Liberties Union. And no one person has to own the charitable hospital down the road, or the United Methodist Church, or the soup kitchen, or the school. Instead, it can have a corporate existence controlled by a board of governors or something. And that's actually been an embodiment of free association in our country. This is a good transition to talking about Alexis de Tocqueville's ideas on this. I think the idea of associations not as political entities, but instead as a part of a civil society that's social and public, but non-political. Right? Voluntary associations that don't wield political power, they can't coerce people, they can't confiscate property. The worst they can do to you is kick you out. Right? And they're voluntary in nature. Tocqueville observes that these are pervasive in America by the 1830s, by the middle of the 19th century, and actually seems to think they're much more important than the kind of political associations like democratic Republican societies or political parties, sorts of things. So let me ask you about that. I know you have an interest in this, in Tocqueville and associations. So and I think your view, Carson, is that Tocqueville, we usually talk about Tocqueville as being very, very complementary to associations, that associations are sort of the lifeblood of American democracy. But you've suggested in the conversation we had separately that Tocqueville doesn't see this as an entirely unmitigated good. So maybe you could talk about what's so important about associations, Tocqueville's ideas, and then what maybe the drawbacks are.
Sure. So Alexis de Tocqueville is the author of Democracy in America, this great and big work examining American democracy in the 1830s, which he undertook to do to explain to the Europeans how to do it right. He thought the Americans were getting it basically right, although he has some criticisms of America and some criticisms of democracy as well. The overall thought behind the book is that democracy is the way of the future, but it may or may not turn out well for the human race. And so we have to examine it and see what are the strong points and the weak points and figure out how to build up the strong points and ameliorate the weak points. And so he does say the science of association is one of the key elements to making democracy work out well, although there is also a danger. So let me just talk for a minute about the political side and the civil society side, where he reveals what he thinks are the good points and the dangers. I think the dangers are mainly on the political side. It's more of a mixed bag there. It's more of a plus purely on the civic association side. So he deals with this, like in volume 1 of Democracy in America, he primarily talks about the governing institutions. Volume 2 is primarily about the political culture. And so nested within each volume, there's a discussion of newspapers and associations and politics. And then in Volume 2, newspapers and associations in relation to civil society. I think a lot of the arguments for political association that he makes in Volume 1 are familiar to us or might be implicit in some of the conversation we've had earlier. The great political danger in democracy, according to de Tocqueville, is, or one great political danger, let's say, is tyranny of the majority, right? The idea that the government will be taken over, to use Madison's terms, by a majority faction that will run roughshod over the rights or interests of a minority. And Tocqueville says one thing they have in America that helps to fight against that is their aptitude for political association. Really fascinating Tocqueville to me is the way he's always bouncing back and forth between what he calls the democratic social state and the aristocratic social state, and trying to point out to us as citizens of a democracy, what are some of the built-in advantages of an aristocracy? One of the built-in advantages of an aristocracy is there are very powerful people in the realm besides the king, and the king can't just run over them. I started, by the way, if I can digress for a minute, I started watching an old TV series called Shakespeare's Age of Kings, which is a filming of all the history plays that was put on TV in 1960. I'm watching Richard II. Richard tries to take over the lands of this duke, the Duke of Hereford, that he's banished. That guy comes back, gets a bunch of other dukes with him, and they depose the king because they're powerful enough to do that. And de Tocqueville thinks that's actually healthy in a monarchy because it means the monarch doesn't have, he's the most powerful single force, but he's not more powerful than all the dukes and barons combined. So that you can't really have, it sounds strange to us, but Tocqueville would say a country like that can be a free country. It's not a self-governing country, but it can be free because the government can't be arbitrary. There are people that can push back on it. In a democracy, there's a danger that it won't be free because the majority can be despotic. So you need institutions that can push back. You don't have them built in anymore. The Constitution doesn't permit titles of nobility. There's no dukes or lords in America who have built-in followings that can resist the government. So you have to build up institutions like the American Civil Liberties Union, all other kinds of organizations. As Tocqueville says, individuals in a democracy are weak. They need to unite together to become strong. And that's useful to the extent that you can push back on the government if it's behaving in a bad way. But then the downside that I was talking about when we discussed earlier is he does recognize that there can be situations where these associations can become powerful enough to overawe the government and cause a lot of trouble. And he speaks in Volume 1 of the meeting that was held, I think in Pennsylvania, in the 1830s of people who thought that the tariff was unconstitutional. Right? And they all got together and agreed that the tariffs were unconstitutional, and you get a pretty close call where South Carolina almost secedes from the Union, almost pursues a policy of nullification of federal law because they think they have the power to do that. So that's the danger. That's, I think, why you have to balance in the political realm. On the civil association side, he's much more simply pro civil association. He says it's necessary to preserve civilization for a lot of the same reasons I've already talked about. If you live in an aristocracy, you have nobles who are built-in patrons of the arts and of education and the rest of it. They see to it that these things are cultivated. You don't have to rely entirely on the government. That's an important thought, by the way, that the government can't do everything that's necessary to civilization. They can't build every school. They can't build every library. Or if they could, you'd be handing them too much power, and it wouldn't be a good idea. So in a country like the United States, where you don't have dukes and lords who can endow institutions, you need to have civil associations to do it. And he says Americans have perfected the art of association more than any other people. And I think part of what permits that to happen is the legal form of the corporation. That just becomes more and more something that's relied upon if you want to engage in voluntary association. Earlier, certainly in England and in America, corporations existed, but they're more the exception to the rule. They would exist because the legislature would create a special charter for them. These days, practically anybody can charter a corporation. You just got to go get the paperwork. But I think that development, I mean, there are obviously some questions you can raise about it, because you get really big corporations that are extremely wealthy. But overall, there is a helpful element to that, in that you can create civil associations that can last longer than the people who founded them, and that can conduct business without fear of being sued into oblivion if you're the individual members, you know.
So what does this mean for our understanding of the First Amendment? If we think about, we thought about the founding generation sort of political understanding of the First Amendment as a set of political institutions almost, right? The ability of certain people to speak and participate in self-government in various ways through speech, press, assembly, petition. And then this other aspect that really has more to do with civil society, with the sort of non-political aspects of our communal existence, of our shared life together. What does that mean for the way we understand the First Amendment? Should we treat these things differently? Would the founding generation recognize this sort of very private, non-political application of the First Amendment? That it's not just assemblies trying to get policy change, but it's associations that are doing the ordinary business of life?
There were universities that they were familiar with, and other kinds of social bodies for a particular purpose. Let's say what Ben Franklin founded, the Philosophy Society of some sort, things like that. They were doing all of that stuff. So they were aware of a civil society outside of government that had its own way of being and needed to be cultivated. So remember, the First Amendment, before the Supreme Court got its hands on it, applied only against the national government. They were thinking about, protecting rights against an overweening national power. But the states, of course, had their own being and thrived on civil association. It seems to me that's kind of what the states did, in addition to provide police protection. So the only question would be, should different standards of right be applied to civil associations than national political institutions? Mm-hmm. And I'll leave that to Carson to answer.
Well, it is the case that, I don't know if I can answer that, but it is certainly the case that the modern Supreme Court has recognized that institutions besides ones engaged in politics have First Amendment rights. Universities do. They would be understood to have a First Amendment right to conduct the kind of education that they think is proper. I mean, private universities. It'd be a slightly different question if you're talking about publicly funded ones, because then the state legislature can govern them. But
we're discovering this.
Yeah. But I think you could make an argument that that is implicit in the original understanding of the First Amendment. I mean, it's common for the Supreme Court to treat political speech as the core protected thing, which I think that does make some sense. But on the other hand, it doesn't say freedom of speech and of the press only as regards politics. It protects it in general. And if you read the founders thoroughly, you will find them saying things in praise of a free press that includes not only that a free press allows people to ring the alarm bell about abuses on the part of the government, but also that it's necessary for enlightenment and amelioration of morality and public knowledge, and civilization in general depends upon it, because, and science, so much, there's a popularization of science and education through the press. And I think that would apply to speech as well. So the idea that there's a First Amendment protection for other kinds of speech other than political, and therefore other kinds of association than political, I think makes sense.
Well, I have a lot more questions, but I'm curious if anybody from our audience has any questions that they'd like to interject at this point before we wrap up. We've got one here. I think we have some microphones. Let's get a microphone to you. Got one there and one here, so we'll start here on the left.
Can you just explain what the difference is between the political association and civil association?
That's a good question. Which one of you wants to tackle this question? What do we mean whenever we say
that is a good question.
Political versus civil association? Because I feel like when I say civil society, students sometimes think, oh, that's politics.
Well, how does Tocqueville distinguish them?
Well, I think they could be ambiguous, right? And in a way, I'll explain in a minute. But A political association is one that wants to influence, say, the outcome of elections and legislation and things like that, whereas civil association might be other forms of cooperation that are not looking to influence the government, but just to accomplish social goods for the society, like Tocqueville might say, building a library, building a school.
Little League.
Yeah, things like that. I say it could be ambiguous because if you form a school, then you might want to lobby the government for certain benefits or regulations or things like that. So they can then become political associations, but they don't necessarily have to be.
So there's a gray area, but there's a distinction between the two.
I would say, look, something like a university, take Princeton University. It's a civil association, but it's also a political association because it's regulated by the federal government. There are all kinds of federal anti-discrimination and other kinds of laws that govern its behavior. So you've got a massive legal team working with the government to serve the interests of the university, but make sure they're lawful. So it's a little complicated, and plus when you think of all the federal money that pours into our universities, it also politicizes them.
So at one end we got political parties, which exist to organize political power and win office. And at the other end we have, Little League and, your local reading group. And in between are all the other kinds of associations, hospitals, schools, churches, clubs of all kinds, and business associations, which are going to be more or less political.
Property associations.
We had one more question I want to make sure we get to right here in the middle.
Oh yeah, so you talked about how the biggest enemy of democracy is like factions, and how one of the remedies for that is having these large geographic boundaries for representatives to come from, like so that they can have a multiplicity of views and backgrounds and beliefs. How would you say, how did gerrymandering become a thing if that was something that they wanted? Like, what is the history of gerrymandering? Like, how does it affect this ability to reduce factions? What's your opinion on them?
You got 2 minutes. The history of gerrymandering.
I don't know my gerrymandering history, I'm afraid.
But I think gerrymandering does go back to the founding era, right? Isn't the term derived from?
Comes from Elbridge Gerry.
Elbridge Gerry, yeah.
So a member of the Constitutional Convention. Gerrymandered. Yeah. That's right. They had a cartoon. What was it? It was in the shape of like a salamander. It was this. Yeah.
Probably.
I will say though, the Supreme Court has recently had a case on gerrymandering, or maybe more than one, and they seem to be inclined to see gerrymandering as basically a political question, not to be determined by courts unless there's some kind of unlawful discrimination that results from it. So, maybe that's the right way to think about it. It's just part of democratic politics that legislatures are going to change the map and try to advantage their own side.
I think we do see it come out whenever we talk about what a gerrymander does. You sort of reach into an urban area and then you grab a big swath of rural communities and you pack them all into a legislative district to get an outcome. One of the things Brad mentioned was that political parties serve this role of sort of creating a coalition. In order for that to work, sort of the different representatives have to come from coherent communities. So a member of the legislature needs to be able to identify what is the interest and views and convictions of my constituents. Well, that assumes some commonality among your constituents. So in an ironic way, if the sort of Federalist 10 logic for legislatures and political parties is going to work, then the sort of districts from which representatives come kind of need to have a lot in common individually. So this would be a bit of an ironic finding. Like if you want this effect in the legislature, if you want this pluralism in the legislature, you've got to actually have some uniformity in each legislative district. But that becomes a problem in itself, right? Do we really want to draw district lines to try to get people who are a lot alike into one place? So it does sound in the question. I think we've run short of time. I've very much appreciated the conversation. I've relished this. I hope you all have benefited from it, and I hope you'll join me in thanking Dr. Holloway and Dr. Wilson for joining us this morning. That concludes this part of the program. We have an afternoon panel at 2 p.m. this afternoon in Clarke Building 510 and 511. That's on the 5th floor of this building. That will be on sort of modern controversies in the constitutional law of freedom of association. We'll be joined by a couple of scholars of constitutional law for that. For those who are attending the invitation-only lunch, there will be CCS staff who will be leading us over for that. You will need to make sure that you depart with one of those students or with a group of those no later than 11:50, so in 5 minutes. So you should be walking that way within the next 5 minutes. Thank you all very much for coming.